The two names did not appear on the list of suspected terrorists kept at all U.S. entry points, and so the men had no trouble slipping through the net.
This was one of the most terrible things we found out in our work, in that the intelligence agencies had cultures where they kept things very much to themselves, and they didn't share information with other intelligence agencies. Had they shared information, very possible the plot would have been disrupted.
The two al-Qaeda suspects made their way to San Diego. Before long, they both had driver's licenses, and Nawaf al-Hazmi was even listed in the San Diego phone book. The two men signed up for lessons at a local flight school, but they were completely lacking in natural abilities. After a few sessions, their instructor, Rick Garza, told them that there was just no point in continuing.
They seemed to have a very strong interest in flying larger aircraft, and that's when they brought up the subject of flying Boeings. Where can we learn to fly Boeings? And I just kind of chuckled a little bit, and I said, it's a long road before you get to Boeings, several years from now. But you have to start out in a smaller aircraft. If you can't fly the little four-seat aircraft, there's no way you're going to be able to fly a Boeing.
The two men reported back to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that learning to fly was a lot more difficult than expected. He was surprised.
Bin Laden and I never considered whether any special skills or talents were needed to pilot an aircraft. We thought that learning to fly an airplane was much like learning to drive a car. It was easily accomplished with the correct instructions. It was a mistaken judgment.
The al-Qaeda leadership decided that they needed hijackers to pilot the planes who would be much more proficient in English and comfortable in the West. University students Muhammad Atta, Zayed Jarrah, and Marwan al-Sheikhi had just shown up in Afghanistan to train for jihad and were immediately assigned to the 9/11 operation. Another recent al-Qaeda recruit, Hani Hanjour, was already trained as a pilot.
I wanted Hanjour to pilot the plane that would strike the Pentagon, given that the Pentagon would be a tough target because it is not a tall building. I figured that Hanjour would be the best qualified of the pilots.
While al-Qaeda was relentlessly pushing forward with the 9/11 plot, U.S. intelligence found a new weapon in its secret war against Osama bin Laden. A year before 9/11, a new American weapon appeared in Afghanistan that could have dealt al-Qaeda a mortal blow. The Predator was an unmanned aircraft, remotely piloted by CIA technicians in neighboring countries, or even back in the United States. The drone was equipped with a camera that would beam back real-time video images to CIA headquarters. On its very first flight over bin Laden's home at Tarnak Farm on September 7, 2000, the Predator captured video of a tall man dressed in white, surrounded by commandos dressed in black. CIA headquarters was convinced it was Osama bin Laden. 3 weeks later, another flight captured a very similar scene.
I was able to see the film at headquarters after the fact, and so it was a great step forward. And then there was a lot of talk about arming the Predator so that we could actually launch missiles against a target once we spotted it. And that took a while to develop that capability.
As work proceeded on arming the Predator with Hellfire missiles, the new weapon became the focus of infighting in Washington. The CIA argued that it should not have to pay for the Predator or to replace it if it crashed. It wanted the Defense Department to foot the bill. At the White House, Richard Clarke reacted with a blistering memo. He wrote, "Either al-Qaeda is a threat worth acting against or it is not. CIA leadership has to decide which it is and cease these bipolar mood swings." Clarke knew, however, that he was now widely dismissed as being obsessive about Osama bin Laden.
Now, an awful lot of people looked at bin Laden and said, well, you know, he really hasn't done that much. Prior to 9/11, people thought that. You know, they said, well, on one day he attacked 2 embassies and 17 Americans were killed. And on another day he attacked a U.S. destroyer and 19 Americans were killed. But all told, the number of Americans killed by bin Laden was, you know, less than 50 over the course of a decade. And some people said, you know, 50 Americans die every time we have a 3-day weekend in holiday crashes. Get a grip, Dick. Get perspective. This is not a big threat.
Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden took a personal role in training the men who would become the so-called muscle hijackers on 9/11, the men who would storm the cockpit and control the passengers.
We instructed the muscle hijackers to focus on seizing the cockpit first, and then worry about seizing control over the rest of the plane. They did not learn the full details of the operation, including the fact that the planes they hijacked would be flown into buildings until they reached the United States in the spring and summer of 2001.
The muscle hijackers began arriving in the United States. Many of them were allowed through immigration, despite incomplete travel documents that should have kept them out.
16 of the 19 shouldn't have gotten into the United States in any way at all, because there was something wrong with their visas, something wrong with their passports. They should simply have been stopped at the border. That was 16 of the 19. Obviously, if even half of those people had been stopped, there never would have been a plot.
In the spring and summer of 2001, U.S. intelligence began hearing chatter about the 9/11 plot. A CIA informant reported that Osama bin Laden was interested in using commercial pilots as terrorists. On June 22nd, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a bulletin to airlines warning of a possible hijacking plot by Islamic terrorists. On June 25th, there was a threat advisory to all government agencies warning about the high probability of imminent spectacular terrorist attack by al-Qaeda. The Deputy Secretary of State saw all of those warnings. Richard Armitage.
There were a lot of reports in the early summer of 2001 that the terrorists were planning something. It was unknown. There was one speculation that airplanes could be used. And I remember George Tenet, the then director of CIA, running around town pounding on desks saying, something's going to happen. I don't know when and where, but it's going to happen.
Perhaps the biggest warning came directly to the president. On August 6, 2001, while on vacation in Crawford, Texas, George Bush was given his presidential daily brief. The headline is stark: Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. The document suggested al-Qaeda would follow the example of World Trade Center bomber Ramzi Yousef and bring the fighting to America. It highlighted patterns of suspicious activity in this country, consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks. But no action was taken. In that fateful summer of 2001, Counterterrorism Director Richard Clarke decided he had had enough. He asked to be reassigned.
So I thought, you know, maybe they're right. That it looks like I am Captain Ahab going after the white whale. And maybe if somebody else were in this job and came to the same conclusion that al-Qaeda was a major threat, then maybe they'd believe them.
In August 2001, the CIA finally shared some key intelligence that could have prevented the 9/11 attack. The CIA told the FBI that Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar were al-Qaeda agents with U.S. visas and should be tracked down.